Take a second and just look at the smartphone you're probably holding in your hand right now.
Right.
Or, maybe you're listening to this while sitting in traffic, driving an electric vehicle, feeling pretty good about reducing your carbon footprint.
Sure, yeah.
We tend to view these things as, like, the ultimate marvels of the digital age. They are the champions of our modern era, the vanguard of the green transition.
Absolutely.
And by design, they feel sleek, clean, and almost entirely detached from anything physical or messy. The glass is smooth, the software is intuitive, the motors are completely silent.
Yeah, and that is a very deliberate design philosophy.
Right.
The end product you hold in your hand or the car you drive is engineered specifically to hide the friction of how it was made. We just interact with that frictionless surface.
Like that.
We like things to be clean, categorized, and, most importantly, disconnected from the heavy, industrial, and often brutal realities of mass production. The digital world feels like it exists in the cloud.
Like it's completely separate from the earth. But then, you step out of that clean consumer bubble and you start tracing the origins of those devices. And the picture changes completely.
It really does.
What if the very core of those marvels, like the literal battery, keeping that screen bright, or the circuits processing this audio, or the power cell turning those car wheels, what if all of that is directly tethered to a child holding a hand shovel?
Yeah.
Just standing knee-deep in toxic water in a hand-dug pit.
It is an incredibly jarring image to confront. And the most unsettling part of confronting it is the realization that it's not a metaphor. It is not an exaggeration at all.
It's real.
It is a tangible physical and economic reality. There is an unbroken, verifiable supply chain that connects the device in your pocket directly to the earth in Central Africa.
And that striking disconnect is exactly what we are going to explore today. So, welcome to this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
Our mission today is to unpack a massive, highly comprehensive research dossier titled Blood in the Battery. This dossier was actually compiled as a capstone for the Global Blueprint, which is a global sibling series to Backyard Empire, focusing on historical power dynamics.
It's a huge project.
It really is. It's a synthesis of some very heavy-hitting, sobering sources. We are looking at data compiled from the U.S. Department of Labor, deep investigative field reports from Amnesty International.
Yeah, extensive data from United Nations groups.
Right, and scholarly works too, including Siddharth Kar's highly discussed book, Cobalt Red.
And the goal of bringing all these diverse sources together into one dossier is to trace a very specific century-long historical arc.
Okay.
We're focusing on the Democratic Republic of the Congo, or the DRC. The dossier treats this as the ultimate modern counterpart to historical mining extraction centers.
Got it.
If you look at the historical mines trio, like the Anaconda copper mines in Chile, the Cerro de Pasco polymetal mines in Peru, or the Bolivian tin barons, you see a specific pattern of foreign wealth extraction.
Right, like we've seen before.
Exactly. The DRC is that same model, but brought entirely into the 21st century. We are going to trace its mining industry from the early 20th century.
When it provided the uranium that fueled the world's first atomic bombs.
Right. All the way to the present day, where it supplies the cobalt and coltan that literally power our digital and electric lives.
It is a massive historical journey. And to really understand the mechanics of it, I feel like we need a framework.
We do.
The dossier continually refers to this concept of the mining enclave model. I know you mentioned Chile and Peru, but break down what that model actually looks like in practice.
Sure.
Why is it different from, say, a coal mine in Pennsylvania or an oil rig in Texas?
Well, the mining enclave model is a concept used by economic historians to describe a very specific, often devastating type of extraction economy.
Oh.
The defining characteristic is that a nation's primary wealth, its most valuable geological asset, lies buried in the ground, but the host nation does not actually benefit from it.
Wait, not at all.
Essentially, no. Instead, a literal and figurative fence is built around the resource. The mineral is extracted as a raw material and immediately exported.
So it's treated less like a domestic industry and more like a foreign outpost planted on sovereign soil.
Exactly that. I mean, in a healthy domestic mining industry, the extraction of the raw material fuels local manufacturing, which creates secondary industries, which builds a robust local middle class.
The wealth circulates.
Right, it circulates. But in an enclave economy, that circuit is broken. The wealth is entirely controlled by foreign capital.
Wow.
The staggering profits flow entirely outward to foreign capitals and foreign shareholders, while leaving the local population structurally impoverished.
Jeez.
The roads and railways they build don't connect cities to help locals. They connect the mine to the port to facilitate export. The DRC is the textbook definition of the mining enclave model, just updated for our modern tech economy.
So the wealth is piped out, and the environmental and human cost is left behind to be dealt with by the locals.
Exactly.
I want to trace how that actually started in the Congo, because the historical through line here is fascinating. The dossier starts this timeline way back in 1906, right? In a region called Katanga.
Yeah, 1906 is the foundational year for understanding the modern DRC's relationship with the world.
Okay.
This is the year a company called Union Minière du Haut-Katanga, or UMHK, was founded. This was a colossal Belgian colonial mining giant.
Right.
And for decades, this single company operated essentially as a state within a state in the Katanga region, which is in the southern part of the Congo. They controlled the entire copper, cobalt, and uranium complex.
When you say a state within a state, that implies they weren't just showing up, digging holes, and leaving. They were like running the infrastructure, the policing, the whole administrative show.
Oh, absolutely. They engineered the entire society around extraction. They built the roads, but only the roads they needed.
Right.
They built the railways to ship the ore out. They built highly segregated company towns to house their workers. It was a paternalistic, heavily controlled colonial extraction enclave.
So the government and the company were basically the same thing.
The Belgian administration and UMHK were effectively indistinguishable. And the sheer strategic value of the geology they were sitting on is almost unparalleled in modern history.
The dossier highlights one mine in particular from this era, the Shinkolobwe mine. And this is where the history connects directly to the most destructive moment of the 20th century.
Yes. Shinkolobwe is a name that should be much more famous than it is.
Yeah.
It was a mine controlled by UMHK, and it happened to sit on the richest, highest-grade vein of uranium ever discovered on Earth.
Wow.
To give you some context on the chemistry and geology, the uranium ore being mined in the United States or Canada at the time might have had a uranium concentration of a fraction of 1%.
Okay.
The pitchblende ore coming out of Shinkolobwe often had a concentration of over 65%. It was practically glowing in the dark.
That is an insane difference in purity, 65%.
It was so pure that it was the only viable source of uranium that could meet the incredibly demanding timeline of the Manhattan Project.
That's wild.
That specific Congolese uranium, dug out of the ground by colonial subjects under Belgian control, was secretly shipped across the Atlantic.
Wow.
It was the material that fueled the world's first atomic bombs. The atomic age was literally birthed from the earth of the Katanga enclave.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second, because here's where it gets really interesting to me. It's like this specific patch of Earth, the Katanga region, is a cursed magnet.
A cursed magnet. I like that.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the arc of human history over the last 100 years, whatever the world's most powerful nations desperately need to dominate a specific era, they rip it out of this exact same ground.
Yes.
In the early 20th century, they needed copper for the industrial boom and the electrification of cities. They went to Katanga. In the 1940s, they needed hyper-pure uranium to build the atomic bomb and win a global war. They went to Katanga.
And
now, today, we desperately need cobalt to build electric vehicles and save the climate. And where do we go? The exact same plot of land.
it is the resource curse manifested in its most concentrated historical form.
Yeah.
It highlights a deeply uncomfortable reality about global progress. A century of the world looking at its blueprint for the future, realizing it needs a highly specific, rare material to make that future a reality, and repeatedly turning to Central Africa to extract it at the lowest possible cost to the global north.
But the geopolitical landscape doesn't stay frozen, right? We aren't in 1906 anymore, and the Belgians aren't running a formal colonial empire.
Right, things shifted.
The dossier outlines a major shift in the 1960s and 70s during the era of African independence. UMHK, this massive Belgian colonial giant, didn't survive that transition intact, did it?
It did not. Following the DRC's independence, there was an immense push to reclaim national sovereignty over the country's incredible wealth.
Makes sense.
UMHK was nationalized, it was stripped from the Belgians, and became a massive state-owned Congolese firm called Gécamines. For a brief moment, there was a vision that the wealth of the enclave would finally flow inward, building the newly independent nation.
But that vision derailed pretty quickly, didn't it?
Dramatically so. The country fell under the authoritarian rule of Mobutu Sese Seko, who renamed the country Zaire.
Right.
Mobutu ran a kleptocracy, a government characterized by rampant systemic corruption and the personal theft of state resources. Instead of investing the profits from Gécamines back into the mining infrastructure or the people, the wealth was siphoned off by the political elite.
So the money just vanished into their pockets.
Exactly. The mining equipment rusted, the massive industrial pits flooded. By the 1990s, the once colossal state mining enterprise had essentially collapsed under the weight of mismanagement and corruption.
Which brings up a really vital question. We moved from a highly organized, brutal Belgian colonial monopoly to a nationalized state company that ultimately collapsed.
Yes.
So if we look at the underlying system of extraction today, is the architectural reality any different for the local Congolese population than it was in 1906?
Structurally, the foundation of the enclave remains terrifyingly identical. The variables have changed, absolutely. The colonial monopoly of UMHK was unilateral one foreign power, backed by a colonial army, dictating terms.
Yeah.
Today, the commodity has changed.
Right, no more uranium for bombs.
Exactly. We are pulling out cobalt for the lithium-ion batteries in our phones and EVs, but while the metal being extracted has changed and the corporate logos on the gates of the mines have changed, the foundational architecture of the enclave persists.
The setup is the same.
The immense wealth generated by the dirt is still flowing outward to foreign capitals, and the local population living on top of that dirt remains trapped in grinding, systemic poverty.
The mechanics of the raw deal stayed the same, even as the world around it modernized. But to understand how we got from the collapse of that state-owned monopoly in the 90s to the incredibly complex, globalized supply chain of today, we have to look at who is actually holding the shovels and who is writing the multi-billion-dollar checks right now.
Right.
Which represents a massive shift in how the global economy operates.
It does. The collapse of Gécamines created a massive vacuum in one of the most resource-rich patches of Earth on the planet. And what rushed in to fill that vacuum was not another single colonial power.
It was everyone.
It was a complex, multipolar mix of global operators. We transitioned into a modern global scramble for the Congo's resources.
Multipolar meaning the power isn't concentrated in just Washington or Brussels anymore.
Exactly.
The dossier mentions massive Western mining firms swooping in. Companies like Glencore, which is based in Switzerland, moved in to operate huge, highly mechanized industrial pits. But the dossier also heavily highlights the arrival and dominance of massive Chinese conglomerates.
This is perhaps the defining feature of the modern era of Congolese mining. Over the last 2 decades, Chinese state-backed companies and private conglomerates have executed an incredibly strategic long-term acquisition of Congolese mineral assets.
Okay.
While Western firms are certainly present and heavily involved in extraction, Chinese entities have managed to secure a dominant position, particularly in the downstream refining process of cobalt.
They saw where things were heading.
They recognized early on that whoever controls the processing of these battery metals will control the green energy transition.
And they didn't just quietly buy up a few mine shafts.
Mm-hmm.
The dossier points to a specific landmark event in 2009 that really anchored this dominance. It describes a minerals for infrastructure agreement.
Yes, the Gécamines deal.
How does a macroeconomic deal like that actually function? Because it sounds very different from a standard corporate buyout.
It's a completely different model of investment. Instead of a foreign corporation simply paying cash to the Congolese government to buy the rights to a mine, it operates as a massive barter system.
A barter system.
In this specific 2009 deal, Chinese state-backed consortiums agreed to build billions of dollars worth of national infrastructure across the DRC. They promised to build thousands of kilometers of paved roads, new hospitals, railways, and universities.
I mean, playing devil's advocate here. A country struggling with poverty and a massive infrastructure deficit is being offered brand new hospitals and paved roads.
Right.
On paper, that sounds like a significant upgrade from the old Belgian model, where they just took the ore, built a segregated company town, and left nothing but a hole in the ground.
It is entirely understandable why the deal was struck. It addressed an immediate, desperate need for capital and infrastructure that Western institutions were largely unwilling to fund at that scale.
Sure.
However, the reality of how these minerals for infrastructure deals play out on the ground is deeply complex and heavily scrutinized. The primary criticism is the imbalance of value.
The catch. There's always a catch.
The catch is that in exchange for building this infrastructure, the Chinese consortiums were granted massive long-term concessions to extract millions of tons of high-grade copper and cobalt.
Oh, wow.
Economists who have analyzed the deal point out that the sheer multi-generational value of the mineral wealth leaving the country far outpaces the long-term economic value of the infrastructure being provided.
So they vastly underpaid, essentially.
Furthermore, the infrastructure itself is heavily criticized. The roads that get prioritized and paved are very frequently the logistical routes required to transport the heavy ore from the mining centers in Katanga directly to the borders for export.
Oh, I see.
They are extraction arteries, not necessarily routes designed to connect local communities or spur domestic commerce.
It's infrastructure purpose-built to expedite the enclave model. And the Congolese state itself isn't just a passive observer in all this, right? They are an active participant in maintaining this new multipolar structure.
Deeply active. And this is a crucial dynamic to understand. The national government in Kinshasa is heavily invested in keeping this foreign capital flowing.
Okay.
The dossier notes a very telling reality on the ground. The National Congolese Army, the FARC, is frequently deployed specifically to protect these foreign-owned assets.
Wait, really?
Yes. You will have units of the national military acting as a specialized private security force to guard the perimeters of massive industrial pits owned by foreign conglomerates.
The National Army guarding foreign profits while the local population lives in poverty outside the gates. That paints a devastatingly clear picture of where the state's economic priorities lie.
It does.
Now, I know when we talk about Western firms versus Chinese firms operating in Africa, it is very easy to fall into geopolitical point scoring.
It is, and the dossier explicitly warns against reducing this to a simple good guy versus bad guy narrative based on global superpowers.
Right.
Both Western and Chinese firms operate massive, lucrative industrial mines in the DRC. Both blocs ultimately purchase and process the minerals extracted there to feed their respective tech and automotive industries.
So everyone's involved.
Exactly. Assigning relative moral blame between the two is highly politicized. The structural reality we must focus on is the supply chain itself. The mechanics of extraction remain inherently exploitative, regardless of the flag flying over the corporate headquarters.
That brings me to a thought I can't shake. We traded a single, easily identifiable Belgian colonial monopoly for this sprawling, multipolar global scramble.
Yeah.
We have Swiss giants, Chinese state refiners, and the Congolese government all taking their cuts.
Right.
But did any of this structural evolution actually change the daily reality on the ground for the Congolese people? Or did we just update the paperwork and change the names on the checks flowing out of the country?
If we look at the core thesis of the global blueprint concept, the answer is stark. The daily reality for the average Congolese citizen living in these mining provinces has not fundamentally improved.
Wow.
It has merely adapted to a multipolar world. This modern setup is the clearest indication that the exploitative foreign mining enclave model is not simply an artifact of European colonialism.
It survived.
The blueprint of extraction, the resource curse, is highly adaptable. It can be utilized by state-backed enterprises or private multinational corporations from any hemisphere, as long as the global demand for the resource is high enough to justify the operation.
And the demand right now is beyond insatiable. We're talking about a global transition away from fossil fuels that is entirely predicated on securing millions of tons of battery metals.
Unprecedented demand.
But here's the thing that really stops you in your tracks when you read the underlying sources in this dossier. It's not just giant, autonomous, multi-million-dollar machines moving the earth for these foreign conglomerates.
Right.
If you zoom in on the satellite imagery, operating right alongside and sometimes literally on the fringes of these massive industrial pits, is a hidden parallel workforce.
Yes.
And it brings a deeply, almost unimaginably human cost to this supply chain. This brings us to the individuals the industry refers to as the creuseurs.
Yes, creuseurs is the French term used locally in the DRC, and it translates quite simply to diggers. In the sterile language of global supply chain reports, they are referred to as artisanal miners.
Which is a term that feels violently inadequate for what is actually happening. When we hear artisanal in the West, we think of small batch coffee or handcrafted furniture or a baker making sourdough. It implies care, craft, and a premium product.
It is a profound misnomer that masks the brutality of the work. In the context of Congolese mining, artisanal means survival-driven, entirely unregulated, informal, and grueling manual labor.
Just raw labor.
It means moving earth without heavy machinery, without safety regulations, and without a safety net.
And the scale of this parallel workforce is what truly shocked me. We aren't talking about a few dozen people panning for gold in a river. The dossier reveals that an estimated 15 to 30% of all Congolese cobalt is dug by hand.
Let's contextualize that statistic because the math is staggering. The DRC supplies roughly 70% of the world's total mined cobalt.
70%.
It is a near monopoly on a globally critical mineral, and up to a third of that massive 70% global share is being clawed out of the earth by human hands. We are talking about hundreds of thousands of individual human beings.
Describe the physical reality of what that actually looks like on the ground. Because the sources, particularly the Amnesty International reports and Siddharth Kara's Cobalt Red, describe a scene that feels like it belongs in the 1800s, not the supply chain of a 2024 smart car.
The geology of the Katanga region allows for this because the cobalt ore, often found as a mineral called heterogenite, can exist relatively close to the surface. But accessing it manually is incredibly dangerous.
I can imagine.
You have thousands of men, and often women, using basic tools. We are talking about standard agricultural shovels, pickaxes, and literally lengths of steel rebar used to chip away at the rock face.
Just hand tools.
They dig vertical shafts down into the earth, sometimes tens of meters deep, with zero engineering support. No wooden bracing, no concrete reinforcements.
Right, just a hole in the dirt.
It's a hole in the dirt prone to sudden and catastrophic collapse, particularly during the rainy season. Tunnel collapses are a frequent lethal reality. Miners are routinely buried alive.
That's horrifying.
Beyond the acute risk of a cave-in, there is the chronic physical toll. The ore they are chipping away creates a fine, toxic cobalt dust. They are breathing this in for 12 hours a day in unventilated shafts without any respiratory protection.
Oh, my God.
They are handling the raw ore with bare hands, and they are doing all of this back-breaking, life-threatening labor to produce sacks of ore that they will sell to local middlemen for the equivalent of maybe $2 or $3 a day.
$2 a day to extract the bottleneck material for a trillion-dollar global tech industry.
It is extreme economic desperation.
And this is where we have to discuss the most harrowing data point in the entire dossier. Because it's not just adult men making a desperate choice to go down into those pits. The sources point to the widespread systemic use of child labor within these artisanal mining communities.
It is the darkest reality of the entire supply chain. When a family is living in extreme poverty and the local economy has been entirely monopolized by informal mining, every pair of hands is required just to generate enough income to eat.
They don't have a choice.
Right. Children are pulled out of school, often because the families cannot afford the basic school fees, and sent to the mine sites.
The dossier flags a very specific figure here that has been repeated in major headlines worldwide.
Yeah.
Approximately 40,000 children working in DRC mining.
Yes.
But it also explicitly notes that this figure is contested. I want to be really clear here, because when people hear contested figure, the immediate assumption is that massive tech corporations are just denying the problem exists to protect their PR. Is that what's happening? Are people seriously arguing there are no children in the mines?
No, absolutely not. No credible observer, human rights organization, or even industry insider denies the presence of widespread child labor in the artisanal sector. It is a visually verifiable fact.
Okay, good to clarify.
The contestation is strictly about the numerical precision of that specific 40,000 figure and how it is used. The dossier traces that number back to older UNICEF estimates and extensive NGO reporting, most notably Amnesty International's seminal 2016 investigative report titled, "This is What We Die For."
So why is it so hard for researchers to just get an accurate head count?
Because of the very nature of the artisanal economy. It is vast, deeply informal, largely unregulated, and constantly shifting.
Right.
The population of a specific mining area can swell or contract by thousands of people in a matter of weeks based on the discovery of a new vein of ore or the changing price of cobalt on the global market.
So it's constantly moving.
Exactly. Trying to conduct a precise static census in a dynamic shadow economy spread across a massive geographic area is logistically impossible.
So the 40,000 number might be a snapshot of a moving target.
Yes. Some researchers and critics argue that the 40,000 number might be outdated or based on flawed extrapolations from smaller localized surveys.
I see.
Conversely, many human rights advocates argue that given the massive population growth in the region and the exponential spike in global demand for cobalt over the last decade, the real number of children involved could actually be substantially higher today.
If the data is that fluid, how should we, or a policymaker, interpret that number?
The dossier guides us to understand it not as a definitive to-the-person headcount, but as a well-attested order of magnitude.
Okay.
Whether the precise mathematical reality on any given Tuesday is 25,000 children or 60,000 children, the underlying structural truth remains devastatingly intact. There is a massive systemic crisis of child exploitation occurring at the absolute lowest rung of the global battery supply chain.
It's undeniable.
These children aren't just standing around, they are performing grueling labor. They are working as diggers in the shallow pits. They are working as porters, carrying incredibly heavy sacks of rock on their backs or heads.
Unbelievable.
And they are working as washers, standing waist-deep in toxic, polluted water, sifting and washing the ore by hand.
It just completely shatters the illusion we have built around our technology. We picture modern industrial processes today as hyper-advanced. We imagine massive autonomous machines monitored by engineers with tablets in air-conditioned control rooms.
Everyone wearing high-vis safety gear and hard hats.
Right. The fact that a significant mathematically necessary chunk of the so-called green transition, the literal batteries that are supposed to usher in a clean, sustainable future for our planet, relies on a child with a hand shovel, is staggering.
It forces a massive, deeply uncomfortable cognitive dissonance upon the consumer. It is perhaps the ultimate juxtaposition of the modern digital age.
Yeah.
You have a high-tech electric car battery, an engineering marvel that represents billions of dollars in R&D, the pinnacle of modern wealth, and our best technological hope for combating climate change.
And the physical life of that battery begins in a muddy, hand-dug pit in one of the poorest nations on Earth.
Extracted by a family earning pennies, it underscores the extreme, almost incomprehensible wealth disparity that is fundamentally baked into the architecture of the digital economy.
Which naturally leads to the immediate defensive reaction, right?
Yeah.
If you are a consumer listening to this, or frankly, if you are a compliance executive at a major tech or auto company in Silicon Valley or Stuttgart, your immediate thought is going to be, well, my company is ethical. We only buy from the pristine, mechanized industrial mines operated by the big Swiss or Chinese firms. We audit our suppliers. We don't buy the artisanal, hand-dug stuff.
That is the standard corporate defense mechanism.
Right. But the dossier has an entire section dedicated to explaining why that defense is structurally hollow. Let's look at what the dossier calls supply chain alchemy, because it explains the precise mechanism of how a rock dug by a child ends up in a highly audited smartphone.
The corporate defense of a clean supply chain is built on a fundamental misunderstanding, or perhaps a willful ignorance, of how the global mineral market actually functions physically on the ground.
Okay.
The artisanal ore, the material dug by the creuseurs, does not stay neatly cordoned off in a separate, clearly labeled informal supply chain. It flows directly and by design into the exact same global pipeline as the industrial product.
I was trying to wrap my head around how this blending happens without anyone stopping it. Let me try an analogy.
Okay, let's hear it.
It's like a small, muddy, heavily polluted creek feeding directly into a massive, pristine municipal water reservoir.
Right.
Once the muddy water hits the reservoir, the currents mix it perfectly with the millions of gallons of clean water. By the time that water goes through the municipal pipes and comes out of the tap at your kitchen sink, it's all blended together.
It's all one thing.
You can test the water at your tap all you want, but you can never filter out or identify the specific drops of water that originated in the muddy creek.
Yeah.
You can't separate the hand-dug rock from the machine-dug rock once it leaves the Congo.
That is a highly accurate conceptual analogy. But to understand why it is so impossible to trace, we have to look at the actual physical and chemical mechanisms of the supply chain.
Okay, break it down for us.
The process starts at the bottom. The artisanal miners, the creuseurs, haul their sacks of raw ore to local trading outposts. These are often open-air markets or small-walled compounds run by independent middlemen, known locally as negotiants.
And these middlemen don't care if a machine dug it or a teenager dug it, right? They just want the cobalt content.
Exactly. They test the ore for its cobalt grade, pay the miner cash based on the daily informal rate, and dump the sack onto a larger pile. These middlemen then consolidate the ore into massive truckloads.
Where do they take them?
They take these truckloads to larger regional depots or buying houses, and here is where the alchemy begins. These larger depots are very often located directly adjacent to or are legally contracted to supply the large industrial mining companies and the massive foreign-owned refineries operating in Katanga.
Wait, so the industrial giants are knowingly buying the artisanal ore to supplement their own machine duct production.
It boosts their total output volume significantly, and it's cheaper than operating their own heavy machinery. But the true point of no return, the alchemy that erases the origin, happens at the smelter.
Okay, walk me through the science of that. Why is the smelter the black box?
Because the blending isn't just a physical mixing of rocks in a pile, it is a profound chemical transformation. At the refinery level, the hand-dug artisanal cobalt ore and the industrially mined cobalt ore are dumped into the same massive furnaces.
Literally melted together.
Yes. They are subjected to pyrometallurgical or hydrometallurgical smelting processes at thousands of degrees. The rock is melted down, the impurities are burned away or leached out, and the cobalt is chemically extracted. At a molecular level, the artisanal cobalt atoms and the industrial cobalt atoms become one identical homogeneous chemical compound.
Wow. So once it's melted down into a liquid or a refined powder, the history is literally burned away.
Precisely. You cannot audit a molecule.
That's a great way to put it.
It goes into the furnace as a bag of rocks dug by a desperate family carrying all the human rights violations we just discussed, and it comes out the other side as a standardized, untraceable, perfectly clean-looking industrial chemical compound, typically a cobalt hydroxide or a battery precursor material.
And from there, it's completely untraceable.
Once it is in that refined state, it is loaded onto trucks, driven across the border to ports in South Africa or Tanzania, and shipped primarily to massive battery manufacturing hubs in Asia. From there, it is engineered into the lithium-ion cells that are eventually sold to tech and auto companies around the world. The origin story is completely chemically obscured.
It's totally gone.
This is the precise mechanism of how mineral extraction intimately links global technology demand to local environmental and human destruction. The tech company can look at their contract with the Asian battery manufacturer and say, our paperwork is clean, but the physical atoms in the battery tell a different story.
And the pressure on this system is only accelerating. We aren't using less of this stuff.
The demand curve is exponential. We saw the smartphone and laptop boom of the 2000s create a massive initial spike in demand for cobalt.
Why cobalt specifically?
Because of battery chemistry. When you pack an enormous amount of energy into a tiny lithium-ion cell, the battery inherently wants to overheat and degrade, or worse, catch fire in a state of thermal runaway.
Which we've seen happen with some phones.
Exactly. Cobalt acts as the crucial structural glue for the battery's cathode. It provides incredible thermal stability. It is the chemical reason your phone doesn't burst into flames in your pocket, and the reason an EV can drive 300 miles on a single charge without the battery degrading after a year.
So we fundamentally need the chemistry of this specific metal.
We do, and the EV boom of the 2010s and 2020s has dwarfed the smartphone boom. An electric vehicle battery requires vastly more cobalt, sometimes 1,000 times more than a single smartphone battery.
1,000 times more.
It has created an absolutely insatiable global hunger. And because the DRC supplies roughly 70% of the world's mined cobalt, the global tech and automotive industries cannot cleanly sever themselves from the artisanal reality.
They need the volume.
Mathematically, the global supply chain requires the total volume coming out of the DRC to function. And the DRC's total volume fundamentally relies on that 15 to 30% artisanal output. The hand-dug ore is structurally baked into the foundation of the global digital economy.
It is incredibly sobering to realize how tight that linkage is. So, up to this point, we've been talking primarily about the Katanga region in the southern part of the Congo.
Right.
We've talked about the historical corporate rush, the massive industrial mines, and the grueling systemic poverty driving the artisanal cobalt sector. But the dossier takes a very dark turn here.
It does.
It moves us geographically to a different region entirely, and it introduces a fundamentally different kind of terror. Let's move into the next major area of the dossier, blood minerals and the militia at the gate.
Yes. To understand the full, comprehensive scope of the DRC's extraction economy, we have to shift our focus away from the southern Copperbelt and look at the eastern part of the country, specifically the regions known as North and South Kivu and Ituri.
Okay.
The dynamics here are vastly different from Katanga, and in many ways much more violent and chaotic.
In Katanga, we were talking about massive multinational corporations and a somewhat functioning, if corrupt, state presence. But the East is a completely different world.
Entirely different.
The dossier traces the current instability here back to a very specific catastrophic historical period, the Congo Wars, which raged primarily from 1996 to 2003.
The Congo Wars were a conflict of such massive scale, complexity, and devastating human toll that historians sometimes refer to them as Africa's World War.
I mean, the numbers are just horrific.
It was triggered in part by the spillover from the 1994 Rwandan genocide, combined with the collapse of Mobutu's regime in Zaire. It drew in multiple neighboring nations and resulted in millions of deaths, primarily from war-induced starvation and disease.
And the relevance to our story today is what happened after the formal peace treaties were signed, because the violence didn't actually end.
It morphed. Out of the chaos of those massive regional wars emerged a deeply entrenched, localized war economy in the East.
Right.
In the Kivus, you don't just have foreign multinationals negotiating with government ministers. You have a landscape that is deeply fractured and violently contested by dozens of armed militias, rebel groups, and very frequently rogue or underpaid units of the National Congolese Army itself.
And how do these armed groups sustain themselves for decades? I mean, a militia isn't cheap to run. You have to buy weapons, ammunition, food, and pay your fighters.
They sustain themselves through the earth. The eastern DRC is incredibly rich in a different set of critical resources, specifically gold, tin, tungsten, and a crucial ore called coltan.
Coltan.
Coltan is the colloquial African term for columbite tantalite.
What is coltan actually used for? Why is a militia in the jungle interested in it?
Because Silicon Valley is interested in it. Coltan is processed into a heat-resistant metal called tantalum. Tantalum is incredibly highly prized in the electronics industry because it is used to manufacture tantalum capacitors.
Oh, capacitors.
The capacitor essentially regulates the flow of electricity within a microchip. Tantalum capacitors are unique because they can hold a very high electrical charge in an incredibly small physical volume.
So that's why our phones can be so small.
It is one of the primary reasons we have been able to shrink our technology. If you want a smartphone that is incredibly thin but has the processing power of a desktop computer, you need tantalum capacitors to manage the heat and power on the circuit board.
So the demand is massive, and the militias know this.
Absolutely. So these armed groups violently seize control of the mine sites in the east. They don't usually mine it themselves. They exploit the artisanal miners who are already there.
They just take over.
They set up illegal roadblocks along the jungle transit routes. They extort the creuseurs and the local middlemen. They impose arbitrary taxes at the point of a gun.
Like a mafia.
They essentially run a violent mafia-style protection racket over the extraction of these tech minerals. And they use the millions of dollars in illicit proceeds to buy weapons on the black market, recruit fighters, and finance decades of continuous simmering conflict. This dynamic is the very heart of the blood minerals or conflict minerals trade.
The dossier specifically highlights one group, the M23 militia, as a continued highly active presence in this area. It stresses that this isn't just historical background. It is an ongoing active reality today.
The violence is cyclical, it ebbs and flows, but the financial engine provided by the minerals keeps the conflict perpetually alive.
Right.
If we connect this back to the broader historical themes the global blueprint dossier is drawing on, there is a concept referred to as the Chaco War lesson.
Right, the Chaco War. I remember this from a previous historical deep dive. That was fought in South America in the 1930s, between Bolivia and Paraguay.
Yes. And the fundamental lesson historians and geopolitical analysts draw from the Chaco War is the dangerous dynamic created when global demand intersects with local vulnerability.
Okay.
It is the idea that a massive global hunger for a specific resource, in the case of the Chaco War, it was the belief that the region held massive oil reserves, can act as the primary fuel for a localized, devastating war.
It just pours gas on the fire.
It demonstrates that when the global north desperately wants what is buried under your soil, that demand rarely brings peace, investment, and prosperity. Instead, it brings men with guns who recognize that controlling the choke points of that wealth is the path to absolute local power.
It's the resource curse, fully weaponized. It's not just economic stagnation. It's active kinetic warfare funded by the dirt.
It is. However, the dossier is very careful to explicitly caution us here. It encourages a higher level of critical thinking regarding the narrative of the East.
Oh, you mean?
While it is an undeniable, verifiable fact that the illicit mineral wealth fuels and finances the Eastern Congolese wars, it is intellectually lazy and historically inaccurate to reduce millions of deaths and decades of complex suffering to a single, simple blood minerals cause.
That's a really important distinction. The minerals are the funding mechanism, but what is actually driving the ideological or political conflict then?
The conflicts in the Kivus have incredibly deep, tangled, and complex historical roots. There are long-standing, bitter ethnic tensions that predate the electronics boom. There are generational disputes over land ownership, grazing rights, and who officially qualifies for citizenship. There are massive regional political dynamics, particularly involving neighboring countries like Rwanda and Uganda, whose roles in supporting various proxies have been heavily documented and criticized by successive UN group of experts reports.
So it's a web of issues.
The minerals act as a powerful accelerant. They provide the endless funding that makes the wars impossible to definitively end, but they are not the sole spark that started the fire. It is crucial to respect the political and historical complexity of the region, rather than just viewing it as a simplistic scramble for cell phone parts.
That nuance is vital for understanding the geopolitics. But if we pivot back to the perspective of the global supply chain and the consumer, it brings up an intense, almost sickening realization for you as a listener.
Yeah.
When you think about the massive industrial cobalt mines in Katanga, the disciplining force keeping the miners in line might be a ruthless corporate HR department or a private security firm or even corrupt local police. But in these eastern artisanal mines, the disciplining force isn't corporate. The disciplining force is a man with an assault rifle, completely unaccountable to any law, funding a brutal insurgency through the exact same tantalum capacitors that are currently processing the data in your laptop.
That is the grim, unavoidable reality of the East. The concept of blood in the battery extends far beyond the physical danger of a tunnel collapsing on a creuseur in Katanga. In the Kivus, it extends directly to the financing of armed rebellion, mass displacement, and war crimes.
Knowing this terrifying link, knowing that buying a consumer electronic device was inadvertently funding warlords, it's not like the world just completely ignored it.
No, there is pushback.
The international community, pushed by human rights campaigns, did try to step in and do something about it. Which brings us to our final major topic in the dossier, the regulatory dilemma. We tried to fix it, but did the solutions actually work, or did they make it worse?
This is perhaps the most heavily debated section of the dossier. The most prominent, forceful attempt at a regulatory solution came from the United States in 2010. It was embedded within the massive Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act, specifically a provision known as Section 1502.
Dodd-Frank is universally associated with the 2008 financial crisis, regulating big banks and preventing another mortgage meltdown. How did the jungles of the Congo get tied into a Wall Street banking reform bill?
It was a fascinating piece of legislative maneuvering. A coalition of human rights activists and NGOs successfully lobbied lawmakers to attach a provision targeting the African conflict minerals trade to this massive must-pass piece of financial legislation.
Clever.
Section 1502 created a mandatory supply chain disclosure requirement for any company publicly traded on U.S. stock exchanges.
How exactly did the disclosure work? What did it force the companies to do?
The law dictated that if your manufactured product contained tantalum, tin, tungsten, or gold, which are often referred to as the 3TGs, the primary conflict minerals extracted from the eastern DRC, you were legally required to trace your supply chain all the way back to the mine of origin. You had to conduct due diligence, audit your suppliers, and then publicly file a report with the Securities and Exchange Commission declaring whether your minerals were conflict-free or if they were potentially funding armed groups in the Congo.
The logic makes perfect sense from a Western policy perspective.
Yeah.
You use market transparency as a weapon.
Exactly.
You force the big tech companies, who hate bad PR, to audit their suppliers, thereby creating a system of certified clean mines, and ultimately, you cut the warlords out of the global economy by starving them of buyers. Did it achieve that goal?
The dossier lays out the genuine, deep, and often bitter disagreement surrounding the legacy of this regulation. It is a highly contested issue in the realm of international development.
I can imagine.
On one side of the debate, some advocacy groups and policymakers credit Dodd-Frank and the subsequent certification schemes, like the bag and tag traceability systems, with a degree of structural success.
What does success look like to them?
They point to data suggesting a measurable reduction in the overt militia presence at specific tagged mine sites. They argue it broke the absolute impunity of the warlords and forced massive tech conglomerates to finally take responsibility for the darkest corners of their supply chains, setting a new global standard for corporate accountability that didn't exist before 2010.
But I can hear a massive however coming here. What is the counter-argument?
A very massive, devastating, however. Conversely, the dossier cites extensive critical sources. It brings in reporting from environmental and science news outlets like Mongabay, alongside numerous testimonies from local Congolese civil society leaders, local economists, and field researchers.
And what do they find?
Their argument is that while the law may have looked like a victory in Washington, it was a catastrophic failure on the ground in the Kivas.
A failure how? Did the companies just find clever legal loopholes to keep buying from the militias?
No, it wasn't a failure of compliance. It was a failure of profound unintended consequences. The critical argument is that Dodd-Frank functioned, in practice, as a de facto embargo against the entire region.
An embargo. But the law didn't say don't buy from the Congo. It just said trace your supply.
True, but you have to look at how corporate risk management actually behaves. When the law passed in 2010, major global buyers and electronics manufacturers panicked.
Right.
The supply chains were incredibly opaque, and they did not have the systems in place to instantly, verifiably trace a bag of coltan back to a specific jungle pit. They looked at the legislation and realized that if they got it wrong, they faced the ultimate public relations nightmare, filing an official government report admitting their flagship product funded African warlords.
So what was their solution?
Their solution was the path of least resistance. To ensure absolute compliance and protect their brand, many major buyers simply stopped buying any minerals from the eastern DRC entirely until the dust settled and foolproof tracking systems could be invented.
Oh, wow.
They sourced their tantalum from Australia or Brazil instead. They effectively boycotted the region.
So instead of buying clean minerals and supporting the legitimate local economy, they just cut the cord completely.
Exactly. And the people who suffered the immediate, devastating consequences of that boycott weren't the warlords. The militias had guns. They could pivot to smuggling gold or extorting other trades.
Right.
The people who suffered were the hundreds of thousands of legitimate, desperate, artisanal miners whose entire survival depended on selling that ore to the legal buying houses. Overnight, the legal buyers shuttered their doors. The price of artisanal coltan plummeted. The local economy in these mining provinces essentially collapsed.
Wait, let's really unpack this, because the irony here is incredibly dark.
It really is.
We pass a law in Washington, D.C., thousands of miles away, fundamentally designed so that we, as Western consumers, can feel better about buying our cell phones. We want a little conflict-free sticker on the box so our conscience is clear.
Right.
And the direct, on-the-ground result of our desire for a clean conscience is that a legitimate, hard-working miner in the Congo, the very person we were supposedly trying to protect from warlords, might actually starve to death because his entire industry was just legally blacklisted by the West.
It is the ultimate tragedy of good intentions. Critics argue that this top-down regulation did not end child labor, and it did not bring lasting peace to the East.
That's heartbreaking.
Instead, it wiped out local incomes, disrupted legitimate livelihoods, and ironically, created such intense economic desperation that it actually pushed many starving artisanal miners to join the militias just to secure a daily meal.
That is mind-blowing. The regulation designed to starve the militias actually acted as a recruitment drive for them because it destroyed the only other viable economic option.
Thanks.
It really forces a critical question. Are these sweeping, top-down supply chain regulations actually helping the local populations they claim to protect? Or are they just elaborate legal mechanisms designed to help tech companies look compliant on paper while shifting the sourcing to an easier country?
That is the absolute core of the regulatory dilemma. It highlights the vast, often tragic disconnect between Western legislative intent and the brutal, informal, survival-driven realities of the economies on the ground.
Yeah.
A legal disclosure requirement crafted by lawyers makes perfect sense in a corporate boardroom in California or a congressional committee in D.C., but it completely misreads the daily reality of a creuseur in the Kivas who has no safety net, no savings, and needs to sell a bag of rocks today to buy maize flour to feed his family tonight.
It's just a totally different world.
It stands as a profound cautionary tale about the dangers of trying to solve deep-rooted, highly complex local socio-political conflicts with the blunt, unilateral instruments of global trade compliance.
It is incredibly sobering. And honestly, it fundamentally changes how you look at the devices that surround us. It brings us to the end of the narrative arc presented in the Global Blueprint dossier.
We've covered a lot of ground today.
We really have an immense amount of historical and geographic ground.
Okay.
Let's try to synthesize the sheer scale of what we've learned. The DRC truly is the ultimate, enduring, modern iteration of the foreign mining enclave.
Yes, without a doubt.
We've traced a century-long arc of extraction. We started in 1906 with the Belgian colonial empire, where Union Minière operated as a sovereign power, extracting the incredibly pure uranium from Shinkolobwe that ultimately powered the world's first atomic bombs.
And we followed that arc through the failed promise of post-colonial independence, straight into today's highly complex multipolar landscape.
Right.
A landscape where a tense, intertwined mix of massive Western corporations and highly strategic, state-backed Chinese conglomerates extract the millions of tons of copper and cobalt that serve as the absolute linchpin of our global green energy transition.
And through it all, across a century of changing global technologies, shifting empires, and updated corporate PR strategies, the baseline reality at the bottom of the supply chain remains shockingly, stubbornly constant. Local Congolese populations, including tens of thousands of children, are digging by hand in lethal conditions in the south.
While in the east, the vast mineral wealth continues to finance and sustain decades of unimaginable, localized, armed conflict.
It is a profound, uncomfortable reality to absorb. And for you listening to this right now, the primary takeaway from this dossier shouldn't just be historical knowledge.
It should be a recognition of how intimately and physically connected you are to this story.
Exactly. Your everyday modern connectivity, your text messages, the navigation system in your car, your sleek electric commute, your entire frictionless digital life is not actually floating in a pristine cloud.
No, it is anchored physically, chemically, and economically to the mud and the earth of the Congolese mining enclave.
It's the ultimate paradox of our time. We are building the future with tools extracted from a system that looks suspiciously like the past. And it leaves us with a lingering thought, a final provocative question for you to ponder on your own as you look down at your screen today or as you plug your car into the charger tonight.
Yeah.
As we aggressively push for a clean, green transition to save our planet's climate, are we actually solving the fundamental problem of how we consume the Earth? Or, much like that perfectly clean municipal water hiding the muddy creek, are we just shifting the environmental destruction and the human suffering to a part of the world we deliberately choose not to look at? Think about that next time you power up. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.